Let me open with something that I find genuinely striking. Research on consent interfaces consistently shows that when consent is presented as a simple accept button, agreement rates run above 90%. When the same choice is presented with equal prominence given to declining, agreement drops to somewhere near half. Same people, same data, same purpose. The only thing that changed was the design. So here is the uncomfortable question that hangs over this entire chapter. Is that consent or is that architecture? I once reviewed a sign-up flow where accepting took one tap and declining took 4 taps across 2 screens, one of which was labeled Manage Preferences. Nothing was hidden, everything was technically available, and 94% accepted. So what will you take from this chapter? You will learn to audit consent collection and notices for genuine freedom rather than technical presence. You will test withdrawal, consent logs, children's data and verifiable consent, and consent manager governance. Then you will move to rights, access, correction, erasure, and grievance handling. And you will finish by testing rights management end to end as a real person would experience it. This is where the law meets the human being. Let us begin. So let us get into consent collection, and I want to start by separating two things that get confused constantly. Consent as a legal concept and consent as a screen someone taps. Here is the thing. The Act asks for consent that is free, specific, informed, unconditional, and unambiguous. 5 words. And every single one of them is testable if you know what to look for. Let me take just one. Free. What does free actually mean in practice? It means the person could genuinely have said no and still received the service. So here is my test. I try to say no. Literally. I go through the sign-up flow and I attempt to decline and I see what happens. I did this at a client whose app was, on paper, fully compliant. Checkbox present, unticked, notice linked. Textbook. Then I unticked it and tried to proceed. And the app said, "You must accept to continue." That is not consent. That is a toll booth wearing a costume. And notice how easy it was to find. 1 tap. No documents, no interviews. I just tried to refuse. So do that every time. Walk the flow as a real person would and try to decline. Then try to decline only part of it. Because specific means separate purposes get separate choices, not one checkbox covering marketing, analytics, and sharing with partners in a single bundle. The screen tells you more than the policy ever will. So now let us look at the notice itself, and I want to challenge how you read it. Most auditors read a notice asking, does it contain the required elements, purpose, rights, contact details? That is the checklist question. It is fine, but it is shallow. The real question is, would a person understand this? Let me give you an example. I reviewed a notice at a client that was 1100 words long, written in what I can only describe as competent legal English and linked from a sign-up screen behind the words "Terms apply." Every required element was there, technically flawless. And I would bet money that not one person in 10,000 read it. So here is my test, and it is unscientific, but it works. I take the notice to someone outside the compliance world, a colleague, anyone, and I ask them one question after they read it. What will this company do with your phone number? If they cannot answer in one sentence, the notice has failed. It has informed nobody. At that client, I tried this with 3 people. One said, marketing probably. One said, I do not know, delivery. And one said, honestly, I would just accept and hope. Informed means understood, not disclosed. And check timing. A notice shown after collection is not a notice. It is a confession. So read for comprehension, then read for the moment. So here is a principle in the Act I want you to take seriously. Withdrawing consent should be as easy as giving it. As easy. Not possible. Not available on request. As easy. Now let me tell you what I usually find. Giving consent takes one tap on a screen you are already looking at. Withdrawing it requires you to find the privacy policy, locate an email address, compose a message explaining who you are, wait, and then possibly answer verification questions. Is that as easy? Obviously not. So here is my test, and it is beautifully simple. I time it. I actually time it. How many seconds to give consent? How many seconds and how many steps to withdraw it? I did this at an e-commerce client. Giving consent, 4 seconds, 1 tap. Withdrawing, I stopped counting at 11 minutes because I was still trying to find where to do it. Eventually, I found it 3 levels deep in account settings under a heading called Communication Preferences. But here is the deeper finding. I withdrew consent for marketing. Then I asked their team, what happens downstream? And it turned out the withdrawal updated the app database, but the marketing platform synced weekly. So for up to 7 days after withdrawing, messages kept coming. Do you see? The button worked. The system did not. So test the button, then follow it. Withdrawal that does not propagate is theater. So let us talk about proof. Because here is the situation you need to imagine. A regulator asks you, prove this person consented. What do you show them? And this is where a lot of organizations discover they have a beautiful consent mechanism and absolutely no memory of it operating. Let me tell you what a good log looks like. It records who consented, when exactly, to what specific purposes, through which interface, and critically, which version of the notice they saw. That last one is the piece everyone forgets. Why does version matter? Let me show you. A client had updated their notice 3 times in 2 years. Purposes had changed. So I asked, for a customer who signed up 18 months ago, what did they actually agree to? And nobody could say. The log recorded consent given yes. It did not record consent to what. That log proved that something happened. It did not prove what. And here is a second test. Consent is not permanent. So I ask, show me a record where consent was withdrawn and show me that the processing stopped. Not that the flag flipped, that the processing stopped. I found one client whose logs recorded every consent perfectly and no withdrawals at all, 0, in 4 years. Because withdrawals were handled by email, manually, and never entered the system. A log with no withdrawals is not a clean record. It is an incomplete one. Now, children's data. And I want to slow down here because this is where the Act is strictest and where organizations are, honestly, least prepared. Here is the requirement in plain terms. If you are processing data of someone under 18, you need verifiable consent from a parent or guardian. And you cannot do tracking, behavioral monitoring, or targeted advertising to children at all. Now let me ask you the question that breaks most systems. How do you know someone is a child? I asked this at an edtech client. Their answer was, we ask for date of birth at sign-up. So I said, what stops a 14-year-old typing a different year? Pause. Nothing. Nothing stops them at all. And here is the deeper issue. Their entire compliance rested on the honesty of the exact population least likely to be honest about it. So what do you look for? First, is there any age determination at all, or is it just a field? Second, if a child is identified, what actually changes? Because a flag that triggers no different treatment is useless. Third, and this is where I find the real gaps, verifiable, not just parental. Verifiable. An email to an address the child typed in is not verification. The child can create that address in 90 seconds. Ask, how would you know the parent is real? If the answer is a shrug, you have your finding. So the Act introduces something quite interesting, the consent manager. And I want to explain why this matters to you as an auditor because it changes the shape of the problem. Think of a consent manager as a single place where a person can see, give, review, and withdraw all their consents. Registered with the board, accountable, interoperable. In theory, wonderful. Instead of hunting through 40 companies, one dashboard. But here is what I want you to notice. Introducing a consent manager does not reduce your obligations. It adds a dependency. Let me explain with a scenario. Suppose a client uses a consent manager. A customer withdraws consent there. Does your client know? How fast? Through what mechanism? What if the integration fails silently for 3 days? I have seen this pattern before with other intermediaries. Everyone assumes the middle layer works and nobody monitors it until someone does and discovers a queue with 400 unprocessed messages. So what do you test? First, is the consent manager registered and current? Second, how does data flow between them and you, and what happens when it fails? Third, who watches that integration? Fourth, if there is a conflict between what the manager says and what your system says, which wins and who decided that? And the accountability question. If the consent manager gets it wrong, whose finding is it? Yours. Always yours. Dependencies do not transfer responsibility. So we move from consent to rights. And let us start with access and correction. Because this is where organizations discover the difference between having a right and honoring one. Here is what I want you to understand. Access sounds simple. Tell the person what data you hold about them. But think about what that requires. You need to know every system holding their data, be able to find them in each one, extract it, and present it in a way a human being can understand. Now recall what we learnt about inventories. 2 to 3 times more systems than anyone listed. Do you see the problem? An organization that cannot inventory itself cannot fulfill an access request honestly. It can only fulfill it partially and call it complete. Let me tell you about a test I ran. At a client, I submitted an access request as a real customer through their public channel. Then I separately asked their data team to list every system holding that person's data. The response to my request covered 4 systems. The internal list had 9. Nobody lied. The team fulfilling requests only had access to 4. They did not know the others existed. And correction is worse because correction must propagate. Fixing it in one place while 5 hold the error is not correction. So test it live. Submit a request. Be a customer. Then compare what you receive with what you know exists. So now erasure. And I will be honest with you, this is the hardest right to actually honor and the easiest one to claim. Here is why. Deletion sounds like an action. Press a button, data disappears. But in a modern architecture, one record lives in a primary database, a replica, a warehouse, a cache, an analytics tool, 3 vendor systems, a backup taken nightly, and an archive on tape somewhere. So when someone says we deleted it, my question is always the same. Deleted from where? Let me tell you about a client who genuinely believed they had this solved. They showed me their deletion process. Well built, automated, logged. I was impressed. Then I asked about backups. And they said, well, backups are retained for 90 days on a rolling basis, so it eventually ages out. Fine, defensible. That is a reasonable position. So I asked, what if you restore from a backup taken before the deletion? What happens to that record? Long silence. It comes back. It just comes back, alive, and nobody would ever know. They had no post-restoration reconciliation. None. So here is what you test. Where does deletion reach? What is excluded and why? Is there a legal hold check? And what happens after a restore? And ask for evidence. A log showing records deleted with counts and dates. Claims are not proof. So let us talk about grievances. And here is something I said earlier that I want to return to. Zero complaints worries me more than 100. Why? Because zero usually means one of two things. Either nobody can find the channel or nobody believes it works. Let me tell you what I do. I try to complain. Genuinely. I go to the website as a member of the public and I try to find how to raise a privacy grievance. At one client, this took me 9 minutes. 9 minutes and I knew exactly what I was looking for. It was in the privacy policy, paragraph 14, an email address with no name attached. A normal person would have given up in 90 seconds. Then I sent one and I waited. 14 days, no response. So I asked their team about it and they said, "Oh, that inbox goes to a distribution list. Nobody owns it." Nobody owned the grievance channel. That is not a process failure. That is an absence dressed as a process. So what do you test? Findability first. How many clicks from the home page? Second, acknowledgement. Does anything come back and how fast? Third, ownership. Who is accountable? By name. Fourth, closure. Show me the last 10 grievances and how they ended. And fifth, escalation. Does the person know they can go to the board? If they never tell people that, the grievance mechanism is a container, not a route. So let us close this chapter with my favorite technique in the entire rights area, the end-to-end test. Here is what it means. You stop being an auditor for a moment and become a person, a real data principal, exercising a real right through the real public channel with no announcement. And I mean no announcement. Because the moment the organization knows you are testing, you are measuring their best behavior, not their normal behavior. Let me tell you how this played out at a client. With the CEO's written permission, I submitted 3 requests as an ordinary customer over 2 weeks. 1 access, 1 correction, 1 erasure. Different channels, no flags. The access request came back in 19 days, covering 4 of 9 systems. The correction was made in 1 system and never propagated. And the erasure, this is the good part, the erasure got a reply asking me to attach a scan of my identity document and email it to an address I could not verify. So to exercise my privacy right, I was asked to send identity documents over unencrypted email to an unnamed inbox. 3 requests, 3 findings, 2 weeks, and not a single interview needed. So here is my advice. Get permission first, always. Then walk through the front door like everyone else does. Because the front door is where your customers live, and it is the one place documentation cannot reach.